Cultural genocide. What comes to your mind when you hear these two words? I'm sure most of you would think of Nazi Germany and the Jews, or China and the Uyghurs, or Myanmar and the Rohingyas. What about Canada, the beacon of multiculturalism? Why don't we ever think of Canada?
There's a portion of their property near the banks of the South Thompson River that they've got closed off. That's where the suspected mass grave site is.
This is a country where a cultural genocide of indigenous population went on till the 1990s, where indigenous children were separated from their families and subjected to forced assimilation at residential schools.
For Canada's Indigenous people, it's another tragic but not unexpected moment. Less than a month after the remains of 215 children were found in British Columbia, another unmarked mass grave at another Catholic residential school, uncovered in Saskatchewan province. This one 3 times bigger than the last.
In May, Chief Roseanne Casimir announced that the remains of 215 children had been found near the city of Kamloops in southern British Columbia as part of a preliminary investigation. Some of the remains are believed to be of children as young as 3 years old. All of the children are believed to have been students at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, the largest such institution in Canada's residential school system. The remains had been confirmed with the help of ground-penetrating radar technology, Chief Casimir said. Indigenous leaders and advocates have said that they expect the 215 figure to rise, and it has. The Kamloops School, which operated from 1890 until 1969 and held up to 500 Indigenous students at any one time, many were sent to live at the school hundreds of kilometres from their families. The Kamloops Residential School was one of more than 130 others like it. The schools were operated in Canada between 1874 and 1996, and they were the linchpin in the government's policy of forced assimilation. Some 150,000 First Nations children were taken from their families during this period and placed in state-run boarding schools. The policy traumatised generations of Indigenous children who were forced to abandon their native languages, speak English or French and convert to Christianity. Christian churches were essential in the founding and operation of the schools. The Roman Catholic Church in particular was responsible for operating up to 70% of residential schools, according to the Indian Residential School Survivors Society. Since the 215 found in May, the number has risen to over 1,000, involving multiple schools and across the country. All this has triggered a national reckoning over Canada's legacy of residential schools. But the problem is much older than this, with advocates fighting tooth and nail to get this investigated over the span of decades. It seems finally there will be a chance for justice for all those innocent kids. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC report, released in 2015, and it detailed sweeping failures in the care and safety of these children, and how complicit the church and government was in the whole debacle. Government, church and school officials were all well aware of these failures and their impact on student health. If the question is, who knew what when? The clear answer is everybody in authority at any point in the system's history, the authors wrote. Students were often housed in poorly built, poorly heated and unsanitary facilities. Many lacked access to trained medical staff and were subject to harsh and often abusive punishment, the report goes on to say. Physical and sexual abuse led to some children running away. Others died of disease or just by accident amid neglect. As late as 1954, the death rate for children at residential schools was nearly 5 times higher than that of other Canadian school children, and in the 1960s, the rate was still double that of the general student population. The squalid health conditions, the report said, were largely a function of the government's resolve to cut costs. The number of people who lost their life due to this is staggering, an estimated 6,000 at least, with over 3,000 confirmed at the date of writing, and most of these are thought to be children.
Indian culture is a contradiction in terms. They are uncivilized. The aim of education is to destroy the Indian. Nicholas Flood David Report, 1879.
Prior to the Dominion of Canada Federation in 1867, there existed a tripartite relationship in Canada between the British Empire, colonies and Indigenous nations. This relationship was unilaterally changed by legislation in 2 steps. In 1960, the Indian Land Act transferred authority over Indigenous people and Indigenous lands from the British to the colonists. Second, the 1867 Constitution Act shuffled authority over Indigenous people and lands from colonists into the new federal government of the Dominion of Canada. At that time, colonies then became provinces under the new Dominion. The new tripartite relationship created in 1867 was between British, federal and provincial governments. There was no mention of Indigenous nations, rights or treaties was included within the Constitution of Canada. Indigenous peoples were not recognised. The Constitution Act of 1867 began what could be called a policy of non-recognition. Indigenous rights were not recognised and therefore were not and did not need to be included in legislation. The first Indian Act was also passed in 1876. It created a legislated regulatory framework for laws that empowered displacement and assimilation. The Indian Act is still an active legislation in Canada that affects a large number of Indigenous communities. Control over Indigenous political structures, lands, resources and economic development. The sole purpose of the Indian Act was to displace and assimilate Canada's Indigenous peoples, and long story short, that is why the schools were ever there in the first place. These are the policies that people are talking about in reference to the newly found graves. I made this video to try and explain the situation the best that I can, and as mentioned, some people have been fighting to get this investigated for a long time, and survivors are telling their story and some of the accounts are harrowing. If you would like to know more about the situation, I will leave plenty of links in the description. I know this is a little different from the usual videos on the channel, and we will be getting back to normal programming soon if you like. But just to close this video, if this has touched your heart in any way, please do consider donating. A lot of the work that's happened sort of over the years has all been due to charity, and they rely quite heavily on donations. If you can afford anything, I'm sure they would appreciate it very much. There'll be a load of charities also included in the description. Thank you for watching. I do hope you're taking care of yourselves out there. Hope to see you in the next one. Take care. Peace.